So Dr. Greg Brown is a professor of exercise science at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. His primary areas of teaching and research focus on the anatomical and physiological factors that influence health and human performance. Dr. Brown's research evaluates the effects of nutritional supplements on the physiological response to exercise, the physiological response to various types of exercise, and sex-based differences in sports performance. Dr. Brown has over 50 peer-reviewed publications and serves as a peer reviewer for numerous academic journals. He is a member of the American College of Sports Medicine, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and the Association of American Educators. He has been recognized as a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine for his research endeavors. Dr. Brown has a BS in physical education from Utah State University, an MS in exercise and sports science from Iowa State University, as well as a PhD in health and human performance from Iowa State. Dr. Brown and his wife Amber have 2 adult sons and an amazing daughter-in-law, and his hobbies include running, hunting, fishing, studying history, and watching movies. Tonight, he's here to give his presentation, Males and Females Are Different, and That Matters in Sports. So Dr. Brown, you can take it away. Thank you so much.
Well, Robert, thank you very much for that gracious introduction. And thank you everyone for tuning in here tonight. I'm so just excited to be able to give this opportunity and grateful for the opportunity to share this information with people. As you know, we've had a little bit of controversy coming on with this and some stops and starts, but I really appreciate everybody endeavoring to join in and watch this. And so I figure a lot of people probably don't know where Kearney, Nebraska is because we're not a tourist destination necessarily. And so you can see the arrow pointing to Kearney, Nebraska. It's south central Nebraska. That's the Platte River running along there. If you look down the bottom corner, you can see the archway. So if you have driven the 455.3 miles of Interstate 80 that run through Nebraska, you've passed it under the archway. And so that's something you might recognize from coming through Kearney. The other you might see is the sign there that says Kearney, Nebraska, Sandhill Crane Capital of the World. I don't think that was voted on by the Cranes or really by anybody. I think our Chamber of Commerce adopted that. But it is pretty cool to see the Sandhill Crane migration here in Nebraska. And I just want people to know a little bit about where I'm coming from. Not a paid advertisement, all right? I'm not getting any money from the Nebraska Tourism Board or anything. All right, and so as I go through my presentation tonight, I want to start with a little bit of history of how we got this way. So if you look in 1990, Kindergarten Cop, I was 20 years old or so when that movie came out. And there's the hilarious part in there where the little kindergarten 5-year-old boy says boys have a penis and girls have a vagina. And that was considered peak comedy. And you know, it was also what was considered at the time a blatant statement of the obvious and also a little odd to hear a 5-year-old saying that. And so that's in 1990. And then here we are in 2024. And you can see this website, she1.org, that documents 717 female athletes that have been displaced from championships, opportunities to advance by males competing in the female category. And just for me, this has been quite a switch in my lifetime. And so I want to go over a little bit how we got this way. So in the Olympics, they performed biologically based sex verification testing from 1968 through 1996. From 1968 through 1992, it was a cheek swab, and then they would stain the cells to see if there was XX or XY chromosomes. In 1996, they even got more advanced and did testing for the SRY gene, which took a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money. In 1996, the Olympics surveyed female athletes, and 82% of female athletes said it was very important to do the sex verification testing. And 94% of the female athletes said that they experienced no undue anxiety or discomfort at the sex verification testing. Yet in 1999, the International Olympic Committee ceased doing sex verification testing to ensure that they just stopped the verification. And then in 2003, the International Olympic Committee adopted what is called the Copenhagen Consensus, in which the statement was that if a male who identifies as a woman goes through gender reassignment surgery, is castrated, and has 2 years of medical treatment, they could then compete in the women's category. In 2011, the NC2A adopted their transgender policy that stated that if a male who identifies as a woman suppresses testosterone for 1 year, no specific level, just suppress testosterone for a year, then that male could compete in the women's category. In 2015, the International Olympic Committee adopted their transgender policy, stating that if a male who identifies as a woman suppresses testosterone below 10 nanomoles per liter for 1 year, lives as a woman for a year, could then compete in the women's category. Then moving on in 2016 at the Olympics, the women's 800-meter run, the first, second, and third place finishers in that event for the gold, silver, and bronze medal were all males with disorders of sex development. Right. And so starting with that IOC policy in 2015, then you would start to see news and such of males competing in the female category. In 2019, CC Telfer followed the NC2A policy. So CC Telfer ran as Craig Telfer for a few years and was rated 2 or 300th, followed the NC2A policy to suppress testosterone for a year, came back and won the women's 400-meter hurdles in Division II in the national championship. Also in 2019, that is when Selena Soule and her colleagues filed their lawsuit against the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference because they had lost championships, opportunities to advance to 2 males that were allowed to compete in the girls category. Move forward on that, then we get to 2020, 2021. This is when even more news was coming to this issue of males competing in the women's category. We're all familiar with Leah Thomas, a male who identifies as a woman, swam on the male team for a couple of years and was good enough to compete at Division I, still a good athlete, but definitely not qualifying for the NC2A championship. Followed the NC2A policy, suppressed testosterone, came back and won a national championship and competed in a couple of other events at the national championship. We have Laurel Hubbard, who born a male, lived as a male at, I believe, age 36. Laurel identified as a woman, suppressed testosterone, followed the IOC policies. At 43 years old, Laurel Hubbard qualified to compete in the women's category for New Zealand at the Olympics and the Tokyo Olympics. I think one thing to look at there is Laurel Hubbard at age 43 competing in weightlifting in a sport in which the typical age is age 25 and age 28, you're kind of old for that sport. That's just some points to point out there. Because of a lot of the negative news about this and uproar and such, in 2021, 2022, the NC2A, the International Olympic Committee, in essence, changed their policy on it and said that it would be sport governing bodies that would decide the policies. So, for instance, World Rugby or World Aquatics or UCI, which is World Cycling, World Athletics, Track and Field, they have all adopted policies that now state that if you have experienced male puberty, you cannot compete in the women's category in their world sanctioned events. We see different policies in different sports. Some sports have opened it so that if a person identifies as a woman, they can compete in the women's category. Currently in the United States, there are 25 states that have passed laws or have very strict policies that limit participation in girls and women's sports to those who are female. And those laws can influence from kindergarten through 12th grade. Some may influence college, so there's a little variation from state to state on that. And so I think one of the things that I want to point out is right now, there is kind of a hodgepodge of policies, depending what sport you're participating in and even which state you're living in, on what is used to determine the eligibility to compete in girls or women's sports. Does that person have to be female, or can that person identify as a woman or identify as a girl? Which brings us to a very, very important point, right? Are we discussing sex or are we discussing gender? For people my age and people even younger, throughout our lives, the two terms have been used interchangeably. Quite often, someone would say, what is your gender, when they mean what is your sex, or what is your sex when they mean gender. We've all seen that on forums. The American Psychological Association, you go to their online dictionary and look at this. The American Psychological Association says sex is really the biological, physical traits that determined as someone male or female. So it's a biological factor, whereas gender are these socially constructed roles and behaviors that is more of an identity, right? Do you identify as a woman or a man? Do you identify masculine or feminine? And so that does give us a clear distinction. But again, the American Psychological Association, I think we can all notice this from our experience, the distinction between these two isn't regularly observed, and it does make it very challenging when we talk about this issue. So I want to start off with some of the biology on this. So if we start off, human sexual reproduction is binary. A sperm has to unite with an ova in order for the human population to continue. Every one of us is here because a sperm united with an ova. And if you look at this in a biological standpoint, right, the purpose of biology is to propagate your species to a certain extent. When I was a freshman in college in biology, I was told that the way you win biologically is having the most babies, right? And so you have to have the sperm uniting with the ova to propagate the species. And so biologically, having the binary or sperm or ova is very important. And for humans, there's not a third option. There's not another option. It's either sperm or ova. Now, when when the sperm and the ova unite, we are given sex chromosomes. XX chromosomes for female, XY chromosomes for male. And that happens, again, that comes from the uniting of the sperm and the ova. And so biologically, we would say that's when sex determination happens, because either you're given male sex chromosomes or female sex chromosomes. Keep in mind, chromosomes carry genes, genes give rise to proteins, and our body really is just a big collection of proteins that form in the right shape in the right place. So we have our eyes where they're supposed to be, our ears where they're supposed to be, and our body works the way it's supposed to. And so it's very important that how those chromosomes determine the genes that determine the proteins, right? At about 8 weeks of gestation, that is when you can start seeing the differentiation in the reproductive structures for male or female. And so that is what we call sex differentiation. So at about 8 weeks, that is when the fetus is going to differentiate into male and female. And then typically it's going to follow either the male pattern centered on producing sperm or the female pattern centered on producing ova. Which gives us, again, just a couple of quotes, some very important articles here. One, every cell in our body has a sex. If you go back to the Olympic sex testing they're doing, they could do a cheek swab and see if there were XX or XY chromosomes. They could do a blood sample to do that. People who are pregnant, they can have the NIP test, right? The non-invasive prenatal testing done to identify the sex of their baby long before birth, even before you can identify it with ultrasound, perhaps. We could dig up bones in anthropology or something and determine if those bones are from male or female. Another important quote, this is from a great study where they looked at it. Again, keep in mind, we're a collection of proteins, and out of 18,670 analyzed protein coding genes, over 6,500 have sex differential expression. What that means is those proteins are going to express themselves differently in males and females. And then another quote here, the effect of the Y chromosome dwarfs all other DNA polymorphism in the human genome. So whether there is or is not a Y chromosome is going to be extremely important in the dimorphic development, dimorphic meaning you have two body forms of human development. Now, I think it's important to discuss this a little bit. I mentioned this in the 2016 Olympics in the women's 800 meter. We saw this most recent Olympics in women's boxing. We see these ideas of a disorder of sex development, also sometimes called a difference of sex development. This is a situation in which the development of the reproductive pathway doesn't follow the typical pattern, right? So it could be because someone is given not just XX or XY chromosomes, maybe just an X chromosome, or maybe two X and a Y chromosomes, or an X and two Y chromosomes. That can happen. That we might be talking about Klinefelter syndrome or Turner syndrome, but these people, their sex is not ambiguous. While they don't develop completely on the typical pathway, it's still very, very clear that they are either male or female, right? A person with a disorder of sex development may have some variation in the formation of the body, such as hypospadia. That's where the opening of the urethra is not in the tip center of the penis, right? So that would be considered a disorder of sex development, but sex would be very, very blatant at that point. It would not be ambiguous. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Most people with that don't really even know they have it. It's just where their adrenal gland's a little larger, and the adrenal gland does secrete some sex hormones, right? But again, in those cases, sex is not ambiguous whatsoever, but those are still disorders of sex development because the development pathway isn't, completely 100% the typical pathway. Now, there can be situations in which a person's genitals at birth are ambiguous, and this is where a person is called intersex. People who are intersex at birth, it's not clear if they are male or female. Intersex is only 0.02% of all births, so it's very rare. Once again, okay, we look 8.5 billion human beings, 0.02% of 8.5 billion human beings is still a lot of people, but compared to the rest of the population, this is a small percentage of the population. This ambiguous genitalia may be from various things such as not responding to androgens or not converting those androgens to the androgens causing formation of the male reproductive tract. There's even such a thing as the ovotesticular disorder. That's extremely, extremely rare with about 500 known cases, the highest estimate. And I know I was reading one paper where they investigated and actually said out of 200 cases, only 2 were actual this ovotesticular disorder. It's very important to point out that intersex conditions are disorders of sex development, but not all disorders of sex development are intersex. And so if we look at this, again, 49.19% of the human population is unambiguously male, 50.79% of the human population is unambiguously female, and 0.02% of the population, it would be ambiguous. Interestingly, a lot of people who are intersex at puberty, they're not experiencing the normal puberty, and so then they might discuss, go and see what's going on and discover their intersex condition. But the intersex condition, it is a biological condition. It can be identified through chromosome testing or genetic testing or hormone testing. An individual who is transgender is not intersex. There's been research on this looking at the sex chromosomes and showing that the XX or XY chromosomes really offers no insight into whether a person is transgender or not. And so it is important that if we have this discussion about intersex and transgender, we consider these are 2 separate issues, and we can explain intersex biologically. And right now we can't explain transgender biology or biologically. All right, and so kind of gotten the basics of sex behind us now, talk about some of the differences between males and females. All right, there doesn't seem to be a difference in the neural drive, which is going to influence how your body activates muscles for running or jumping or swimming or things like that. There are sex-based differences in how our body stores body fat, the adipose tissue in our body. There is android pattern body fat storage, which is the male pattern body fat storage, storing up more above the waist. There's the gynoid or female pattern of body fat storage, typically storing up more in the hips and the thighs, also breast development in females. And there's differences in the percentage body fat. Women, females have more body fat than males do. If we look at the muscle fibers, right, the skeletal muscle fibers of males and females, and if we look at the size of those fibers, when I talk about size, I'm talking about the diameter of the fibers, so how big around they are, or their cross-sectional area, or the circumference. You can measure it a couple of different ways, but males have larger muscle fibers than females. Larger muscle fibers contain more of the contractile proteins. You have more contractile proteins, you produce more strength, you produce more force. Males also typically have more of the type 2 or fast twitch muscle fibers, and those are explosive muscle fibers that help us to have more strength and more power. Other things we can look at, males have larger hearts than females. Larger left ventricle pumps more blood per beat, and even if we take the size of the heart and control for differences in body size, males' hearts are still larger than female hearts, which gives you a greater cardiac output, maximal cardiac output, higher stroke volume, those types of things. If we look at the lungs, males have larger lungs. They have more alveoli in their lungs. The placement of the lungs within the thoracic cavity, within the chest, is different between males and females. And those differences in the lung placement are detectable at birth even, as are a lot of these other differences. After puberty, males have a lot more hemoglobin. I shouldn't say a lot more, but they do have more hemoglobin than females, higher red blood cell content, so they can carry more oxygen per milliliter of blood than females do. And so if you combine that, a bigger heart that can pump more blood per beat, lungs that facilitate more delivery of oxygen into the blood, those can provide some very significant differences between males and females and for athletic performance. If we look at the bones, males have longer bones in the arms and the legs. Their bones are more dense, so they have more of the chemicals in the bones, right? More calcium, more phosphate, that types of things. So their bones are stronger than females. And again, those differences in bone can be detected before puberty. And so we have all of these very important morphological, anatomical, physiological differences between males and females that are well known and well documented. So if we look at this and we were to make a graph of the normal distribution of males and females, and as a scientist, when you're running statistics, you do a lot of stuff with the normal distribution. If we look at the normal distribution for females and the normal distribution for males on these morphological categories, whether we call it muscle fiber size or body fat or bone mineral density or body height, you can see a very definite female pattern and a male pattern. And so we look at this very clearly. The average adult female is 5 feet 5 inches tall, while the average adult male is 5 feet 10 inches tall. And actually, a woman who is the 90th percentile for body height, taller than 90% of women, about 5 feet 10 and a quarter. So only slightly taller than men who are of average body height. Average adult female is 170 pounds. Average adult male is 200 pounds. Average adult female is 24 to 30% body fat, while the average adult male is 15 to 20% body fat. And so again, we could do this with bone mineral density. We could do this with humerus length. We can do this with various things where you see this distribution of males and females. And so absolutely, there are some females that are taller than some males, but they're not taller than the tallest males. There are some females with more lean body mass or more muscle mass than some males, but the most muscular males are much more muscular than the most muscular females. One area where you don't see that overlap is in testosterone concentrations in adults. So if we look at this graph that I've got here, and I've borrowed it, you see this citation for that. If we look at the typical distribution for testosterone concentrations for females after puberty, you can see that 1 nanomole per liter is basically the typical female testosterone concentration. That's the orange. Then you see in the yellow, that would be women with some kind of hyperandrogenism, where they have more androgens in their blood than typical. And then notice there's a big gap before you get to male testosterone concentrations, right? Now, male testosterone concentrations typically from about 9.8 or so up to about 30 nanomoles per liter. And so I want you to notice one thing. I've got a line on there that's the 10 nanomole per liter range that the International Olympic Committee adopted. That's still within the normal range. So saying that if a male suppresses testosterone down to within the normal range, well, they're still in the male normal range. They are not down into female level testosterone levels. And so if you measure testosterone concentrations in adults, if a male has functioning testes, whether those are inside the body from a disorder of sex development or outside the body in typical circumstances, they will have testosterone in the normal range for males. And you could very clearly see the difference between males and females that way. Carol Hooven wrote this great book about testosterone, and it talks about how it differentiates males from females and all the behaviors that testosterone causes that are, associated with male behavior and all that kind of stuff. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. I'd encourage you to read it. And again, we know in athletics that increasing testosterone increases lean body mass, increases muscle mass, which increases strength, which is why we see athletes that want to use anabolic steroids or testosterone to enhance performance. And that's why the vast majority of sporting organizations don't allow the use of anabolic steroids, because it's considered to be an unfair advantage. And anabolic steroids are going to increase strength by anywhere from about 5 to 20%. Right? And again, that's increase in strength, not directly increase in sports performance, but we know increased strength enhances sports performance. Which brings me to the next part of the topic, right? There are these well-known, well-documented sex-based differences in athletic performance after the onset of puberty. There's a number of papers on this, which I'll come to a little bit later. But if we can look at strength sports, there's differences in males and females in their strength, anywhere from about 30 to 60% difference between males and females, depending on which lift you're using, which group of muscles you're testing. Shoulder press is an area where males are like 120% stronger than females, right? If we look at freestyle swimming, or if we look at running, or we look at cycling, the differences are maybe 7% up to 10 to 15% difference between males and females. And we can see these differences whether you're looking in the high school level, the college level, the elite world class level, look at the recreational level. Once puberty has started, you can see these differences between males and females. As an example, and I want to give thank you to Dorianne Coleman for writing about this in the Washington Post, so I am borrowing her idea. If you look at Katie Ledecky, unquestionably an amazing swimmer. In Dorian Coleman's article, she has this quote in there that Katie Ledecky is better at swimming than anybody is at anything. And there's probably definitely some truth to that. She's incredible, four-time Olympian, right? That means you're good enough to go to the Olympics over the course of about 12 to 14 year period, right? That's amazing. Most people are lucky to get to the Olympics once if they're an Olympian, let alone getting there 4 times in a row. She's got 9 Olympic gold medals, 14 total Olympic gold medals, 21-time world champion, got the world record in the women's 800-meter freestyle. And she actually has the 5 fastest times in the women's 800-meter freestyle. In essence, she has set the world record 5 times. Unquestionably, an absolutely amazing female athlete. Well, 26 boys in the United States between the ages of 15 and 16 years old have beaten her world record, right? The men's world record at 7:32.12 is 7% faster than her world record. In the most recent Paris Olympics, 26 men swam faster in the 800-meter freestyle than Katie Ledecky's world record. And just in the United States, Olympic team trials, 20 men swam faster than her world record. So again, I'm not trying to do anything but say Katie Ledecky is an incredible, amazing female athlete with all of her training and coaching and nutrition and the desire and dedication and everything she has. But when you compare Katie Ledecky to equally amazing male athletes, she is not going to be getting on the podium. Another place to look at this, and when I originally crafted this presentation, I was thinking of Boston. Boston Celtics with Larry Bird, right? That was the era I kind of grew up in with Larry Bird and thinking of the Boston Celtics. And sorry, not everybody is living in Boston is a Boston fan, but I think of kind of as a basketball town, right? Well, if you look at the WNBA that started in June 1997 to May 2024, so we've got 27-year history. There have been a total of 37 dunks in the WNBA in game time, right? 26 of those by one player, Brittany Griner. Total of 8 WNBA players have ever dunked. Compare that to the NBA, where the dunks are measured in thousands per season, and that's that graph on the right. You can see some ups and downs, but from 8,000 up to almost 12,000 dunks per season. Typical NBA game has about 6.5 dunks per game. So in the NBA, they're going to have more dunks in a week than the WNBA is going to have ever, which again just illustrates the differences in the capabilities between the male body and the female body. Typical WNBA players about 6 feet tall. Typical NBA players about 6 feet 6 inches tall, with accompanying differences in body height and accompanying differences in body composition for males and females. The WNBA, they use a basketball that's 1 inch smaller than the male basketball in the NBA. This is from a great paper by Emma Hilton and Tommy Lundberg, where they took all sorts of different sports. You can see that on there, from rowing to cycling to jumping, soccer kick, and they looked at the female performance, which they set at 100%, and then the male performance. And you can see the male advantage in these sports ranging anywhere from 10% on up to 50% or more. Looking at weightlifting, typical, again, like I said, 30 to 50%, 30 to 60% difference. If you look at punching power, on a pound for pound basis, the amount of power in a punch behind an adult male is 162% higher than you would find in a woman of the same weight or female of the same weight class. Keep in mind, 100% is twice as much. So that's 2.6% times more punching power. And if you're familiar with sports, these are huge differences. If you look in the Olympics, a lot of times, and you can see this even in the high school level, the difference between a gold medal and a silver medal is measured in hundredths of a second, right? Is measured in millimeters sometimes in throwing distance or height in jumping, something like that. So a 10 to 30% difference is just gigantic when it comes to sports performance. And so if we look at this, if we look at the average male athlete, he's going to outperform 70 to 90% of the average female athlete. Gabe Higgard actually did a fascinating doctoral dissertation where he took millions of high school records from, I think he specified 5 states, but looked at their high school track and field performances over a number of years. And so a lot of those, he was comparing 50,000 female high school athletic performances to 50,000 male high school athletic performances. Most of the events, the 50th percentile of males would be competing with the 90th percentile for the females, right? And so, yes, some females are stronger than some males, undoubtedly. But the strongest males are much stronger than the strongest females. And yes, some females are faster than the fastest males. or sorry, some females are faster than some males, but the fastest males are much faster than the fastest females. And again, so we can come back to that normal curve and graph this out and see what is our male pattern distribution for athletic performance, the female pattern for athletic performance. And again, these differences are just gigantic when you start talking about athletics and the amount of effort someone will put in to try and shave a few seconds or add a few millimeters or inches to a performance. Sorry, needed to wet my whistle there. And so this is from a paper that a group of 26 of us from around the world published just this last year, basically saying that we think the International Olympic Committee needs to do a better job of protecting the female category to make sure that only females are competing in it. And we can look at the differences in males and females in athletic performance, and then we can look at what are the anatomical and physiological traits that are conducive to success in that particular sport, and we can explain the differences biologically. So if it's something that's dependent on strength, we can look at, the lean body mass, the muscle mass, the fiber type of males and females, and explain a lot of the difference. If it's running performance, we can look at the characteristics, whether it's mechanical efficiency and cardiac output and VO2 max and those types of things. And so we can explain these sex-based differences in athletic performance based on sex-based differences in anatomy and physiology. There's very large biological factors there. Now, one thing I want to point out, in 1972, when Title IX was passed, about 7% of high school athletes were female. Now it's about 41 to 44% of high school athletes are female. So we've seen this great increase in the opportunities for females to compete in sports, but these sex-based differences in athletic performance have been pretty consistent since the 1980s. There hasn't been a much closure of the gap, if any at all, in the performance between males and females since the 1980s. So that again would argue that it's not just allowing females access to sports that's going to erase these differences. There's the biological differences that are setting it up for the male-female difference. And as I mentioned, there are just tons and tons and tons of papers documenting this. This is just a small smattering of them. This is information from every exercise physiology book I've ever used, from the time I was an undergraduate up through now. Every exercise physiology book that I'm familiar with, when they go through muscle, when it goes through bones, when it goes through cardiorespiratory stuff, it discusses the male-female differences in physiology and anatomy, and most of them even have a chapter on sex differences in sports performance. When we do fitness testing, we look at these differences in physical fitness between males and females in terms of strength, in terms of body composition, in terms of aerobic fitness. And so these are just well documented and well known and have been, again, consistent for decades, these sex-based differences in athletic performance. They haven't been changing. Well, and so this brings up a very interesting topic these days of what about before puberty, right? Is there a difference in athletic performance before puberties? I'd like to point this out. This is a great quote, I think. Female athletes are not simply smaller, less muscular males. There are, again, these important biological differences between males and females that give us specific concerns for female athletes. And again, there's been a lot of research looking at and documenting specific concerns that female athletes have that are not shared by male athletes. And so girls and boys, we should, they're equally wonderful, amazing people. I've got a new grandson who's just over 8 months old. It's just amazing, this little human being, so much fun. My daughter-in-law is an amazing person. My wife's an amazing person. So are my sons. So are my male and female students. But girls and boys are different. Males and females are different. I want to point out that the sex-based differences in athletic performance don't suddenly appear at puberty. Now, the sex-based differences in athletic before puberty are smaller than after puberty, but it's not like suddenly somebody flips a switch and now at puberty there's a difference between boys and girls. The difference is there. It gets magnified by puberty. And so if we look at school-based fitness testing, right? And so I've got on here about 21 different papers I've identified. And I'm telling you, this is not an exhaustive search. I know one of those papers is actually a meta-analysis, which is one of our more powerful scientific tools of 38 different papers from 37 different countries, documenting that in school-based fitness testing, boys outperform girls on tests of muscular strength, muscular endurance, speed, power. So doing more push-ups in 30 seconds or more sit-ups in 30 seconds, or doing longer on the bent arm hang time, or running the mile faster, or a shuttle run faster, or long jump further than girls of the same age. And so if we put that in normal distribution, again, we would see the boys in the 90th percentile doing better on these tests of physical performance, physical fitness than girls. Girls outperform boys on tests of flexibility. So typically the sit and reach, but there are other tests of flexibility that the girls before puberty are outperforming the boys. And these papers on this go back to children as young as 3 years old. And in fact, if we look at throwing performance at age 2, there's differences between boys and girls in how far the boy is going to throw a softball or a baseball and how fast they're going to throw it as young as 2 years old. And so again, we can see these differences before puberty. This is just an example from one particular paper looking at this, where it was 30 different European countries, 2.8 million physical fitness tests. So you've got a large sample size, 30 different countries. There's a lot of validity that comes with that type of research. And if we look at standing broad jump or hand grip strength or sit-ups in 30 seconds or the 10 by 50 meter shuttle run time, the boys are 5 to 12% outperforming the girls. If we look at bent arm hang time, look at that. That's a 30+% difference in the bent arm hang time, which really exemplifies the differences in musculature in the shoulders and upper arms between boys and girls even before puberty. And then you can see that the females are outperforming the boys on the sit and reach. Now people will look at that and say that's physical fitness testing. And that's true. I mean, we know people who are more physically fit are probably going to do better in athletic competition, but we don't have the athletes line up and see who can do the 225 bench press and then give the gold medal to the one who has the most reps. We don't bring them into the lab to measure the VO2 max and say, okay, you've got the highest VO2 max, you win the gold medal. We know physical fitness very much contributes to athletic performance, but there are other factors. And so I went and looked at the USA Track and Field Junior Olympics Championship here in Nebraska from 2023, and I took the times and distances for the 8 and under age group, that's the youngest age group in USA Track and Field competition, and the 9 to 10-year-old age group, and I put the boys' times compared to the girls' times, and in the 8 and under age group, all of the medals would have gone to the males. There would have been no 8 and under girls that would have walked away with medal, right? The 9 and 10-year-old group, you see a smattering of girls, smattering of the females that would have gotten medals, but the vast majority would have gone to the males. And so a question you ask yourself is, if those females are not getting medals, are they going to come back? Those 8-year-old girls, if they're not getting medals, are they going to come back? Now, I like to point out, yes, this is from Nebraska. And the Nebraska State Tourism motto a couple of years ago was Nebraska. Honestly, it's not for everyone. And also, when you think track and field, you don't think of Nebraska as a track and field state. You used to think of Nebraska as a football state. We would love to see Nebraska back as a football state. Nebraska is a volleyball state these days. Women's volleyball in Nebraska is huge, and it's awesome, and it's amazing. All right, anyway, off of Nebraska. So what about Arizona? Think about Arizona, the weather in Arizona, generally most of the state, much more conducive to year-round training for track. So it might be more conducive to kids engaging in track. But you see the similar pattern where in the 8 and under age group, most of the medals are going to the males. And even in the 9 to 10-year-old age group, most of the medals are going to the males, right? And again, you could say, well, that's just Arizona. I don't know what their tourism motto is. So this is from that same year, the USA Track and Field National Outdoor Championships, right? Which would draw from multiple states. And you have to do well enough at your region to get onto the national level. So these are really, some of the fastest running, throwing, jumping kids. And again, if you look in the 8 and under age group, most of the medals are going to the males. And in the 9 to 10-year-old group, most of the medals are going to the males. Now, again, I realize that looking at these individual events, individual competitions, that's not a statistical scientific analysis, but it does give us a clue, right? It points us in a direction where we can start making some conclusions. Well, so a couple of colleagues and I, we decided, well, let's do a statistical scientific analysis of this. So we took the 8 fastest finalists from the running events from the USA Track and Field National Youth Outdoor Championship, National Junior Olympics. Those are held one event for each year. So you have the National Youth Outdoor Championship, National Junior Olympics, generally kind of alternating coasts. That'd be 2 meets per year over a 7-year period, and put it all together. And the 8 and under males were faster than the 8 and under females, and the 9 to 10-year-old males were faster than 9 to 10-year-old females. And we're pretty much going to say that's probably pre-puberty. because puberty in girls is going to start maybe around age 9.5. Typically, maybe a little bit later. Boys, it's going to be about age 11, right? And this was in the running events. And what we found were the average boy times were faster than the average female times, and the fastest male times were faster than the fastest female times. And if you want to see kind of how that looks, this is from the 800 meter. And so again, we've got two events, right, or two different meets over the course of 7 years, about 100 individuals in each one. And you can see there the pink circles for the 8 and under females, the blue circles for the 8 and under males, the pink squares for the 9 to 10-year-old females, the blue squares for the 9 to 10-year-old males. And you can see it really doesn't take statistical analysis to look at that and see there is a difference. And of course, yes, we did a statistical analysis. We have our p-value less than 0.001, very strongly statistically significant. Did an effect size analysis, and an effect size helps us to know how important that statistical difference is. These are large effect sizes, which are basically a large effect size means it's obvious to the naked eye. And so again, and we saw this with 100 meter, 200 meter, 400 meter, 800 meter, 1500 meter. Now, there hasn't been nearly as much analysis of sports performance before puberty as there has been after puberty. Part of it because before puberty, right, the kids are engaging in athletics for fun and for recreation, for basic skill development, and we don't keep the records as close. You start getting into middle school, and especially you start getting into high school, the records are watched very, very closely. You can probably find those results in the local newspaper, on their channel, whatever like that. You don't see that for these youth events. But a few studies have looked at this. I want to give a shout out to some of the people who have looked at this, like Jack Senefield and Sandra Hunter, Mara Atkinson, David Handelsman, looked at these. And overall, trying to put these papers together, on average, before puberty, males run faster than females, about 3 to 7%, and the fastest males are faster than the fastest females. On average, before puberty, males swim faster than females. It's a smaller difference. It's about 1 to 3% difference. And the fastest males are faster than the fastest females. And on average, before puberty, males throw and jump further. The jumping may be about 7% difference, but you get into throwing. In the shot put, the javelin, you're talking maybe a 20 to 30% difference before puberty. Now, again, these differences are smaller than after puberty, but the differences are still present. And so why are there sex-based differences? Well, there's mini puberty. The first 6 months of life, mini puberty, males are bathed in testosterone, much, much higher testosterone. And then from about 6 months until puberty hits, there's not a difference in testosterone between males and females. But does that high amount of testosterone early in life then set the male body forward? Or is this something that has to do with the Y chromosome? This is a very fertile area for research because there's just not been a lot done on it. But before puberty, males have about 10% lean body mass, more lean body mass than females. There's slight differences in the pelvis shape that are favoring running faster for males. And males before puberty have slight advantages in lung and cardiac size and function. Now, are there social factors? Yeah, boys engage in more rough and tumble play than girls. They just do. All right. Girls are also more likely to engage in swimming, which maybe that's why we see the smaller difference in swimming, because a greater concentration of girls to find the better female athletes. Also, coaches will tell you that the girls seem to enjoy practices more, and maybe that encourages them to be better swimmers overall. But these are some great studies from Denmark. If you take boys and girls age 6 to 11, and they engage in the same amount and intensity of physical activity, the boys have less body fat and higher VO2 max and are overall fitter than girls engaging in the same amount and intensity of physical activity. Which I realize I'm going a little long here. I'll try and go quickly. Does gender-affirming hormone therapy erase the differences? Right? When we're talking gender-affirming hormone therapy, typically we're talking about males who identify as a woman, so that'd be a trans woman. They suppress testosterone. And so I've just kind of drawn this out, these curves for the female, for lean body mass or muscle size or muscle mass, and for males. The typical difference there in adults is about 45% in favor of males. And testosterone suppression for a few months up to several years seems to reduce lean body mass by about 0 to 5%. So that's that yellow line showing how the curve would shift. And so yes, it does increase the overlap between males and females, but it doesn't erase the differences between males and females. And again, there's about 18 different studies that I've put together to kind of come up with that. If we look at muscle strength, we've got about 8 different studies looking at muscle strength in trans women. And so again, we've got the female curve for muscle strength, the male curve, and I've set those so they're 45% apart, halfway between 30 and 60%. And testosterone suppression reduces muscle strength anywhere from 0 to 9%. Right? So again, showing that curve shifting towards the female curve, but it doesn't erase it. And this is a great area to point out. If we look at hand grip strength, the trans women, for their hand grip strength, they're scoring in about the 20th percentile compared to males, but they're in the 90th percentile when compared to females, right? And that is after several months to several years of testosterone suppression. If we look at running, we don't have as much information on running. We've really got 2 studies looking at trans women in the US Air Force. And so you can see the pink line there, that's the female performance on the 1.5-mile run. And then the blue, that's the male performance before testosterone suppression. That's the trans women before testosterone suppression. And they're about 18 to 22% faster. Again, showing kind of a typical male-female split there. After a year of testosterone suppression, the trans women are still 11 to 12% faster. After 2 years, they're still 6 to 9% faster. After 3 years, they're still 6% faster. And after 4 years, the difference seemed to be erased, but there's a big, big caveat there, right? Only one of those studies went for 4 years. The other one went just for 2 years. And so that single study that went for 4 years had 223 trans women at baseline and 15 after the 4 years. And so that gives us 208 unanswered questions. And so I would really definitely not hang my hat on this and say that demonstrates the erasure of male-female running performance differences. And so there's been about 9 different scholarly reviews on this published from different authors in different journals that all come to basically the same conclusions, that several years of testosterone suppression does not erase the male athletic advantages, right? It doesn't change body height, typically doesn't change body mass, and only small reductions in lean body mass, which is up muscle strength, which contributes to overall athletic performance. Our next question on this is, what about puberty blockers, right? How do puberty blockers affect this? You've probably seen in the news about the CAS review, and there's a lot of questions about puberty blockers and not a lot of answers. A few studies have looked at growth in body height with the use of puberty blockers. And so you can see where they started puberty suppression, and that white line is representing predicted growth. The yellow line is representing measured growth. And so puberty suppression does seem to impair typical growth. So these males don't grow as much as they typically would, but once they start cross-sex hormones, and again, generally speaking, they'd be on puberty blockers for a couple of years, then start using estrogens, and using the estrogens accelerates the growth in body height so that at adulthood, there's not a difference between predicted growth and measured growth. And one of these authors actually concluded that any difference was probably more due to errors in the prediction equation than the effects of the cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers. If we look at lean body mass, we see a very similar type of thing. If a male uses puberty blockers, it will reduce lean body mass, but not to the level of same-age females. And after puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones, the trans girls or trans women have less lean body mass than typical males, but more lean body mass than typical females. And so from all of these studies, putting all of this together, over 30 different research papers looking at this between the lean body mass and the muscle strength and the running performance and the different things in growth and everything, there are important biological differences between males, which typically means boys and men, and females, which typically means girls and women. And those differences are present before puberty. These sex-based differences give males, including most males with disorders of sex development and males who identify as girls or women, inherent athletic advantages over females in almost every sport, even before puberty. And having a transgender identity, with or without puberty blockers, testosterone suppression, or cross-sex hormone use, does not erase these advantages. So I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank Robert Hayes and the Tewksbury Public Library for hosting this presentation. I think they made a great good faith effort to host this presentation. Thank Charlie McCurskey from the Democrats for Informed Approach to Gender for actually connecting me with Robert Hayes to make this presentation. And I want to thank Wolf, the Women's Liberation Front, for hosting the presentation last night. Again, there was some things that went on, and I'm just glad to be able to host this presentation, hosting it on 2 nights. Hopefully different people are able to see this that might not have seen it other nights. And I'm open for questions.
So folks, let's give Greg a big virtual round of applause, and we'll take approximately 11 or 12 minutes of questions. I do just want to clarify that the library has no affiliation with any of those other groups. I know that once the cancellation happened, quite a few folks started promoting the program. And but anyway, I do want to move on to questions now. And I guess I'll ask the first question, and then we'll get to some questions in the Q&A box. But I wanted to ask about a couple of studies that you didn't mention, Greg, that I'm sure you're familiar with. They were studies that Erin mentioned back in March. One of them is called, let's see, I guess it goes commonly by, I guess, the researcher's name, Moreland, published in 2023. And there's another one by Chang this year in 2024. I believe the Chang one is the impact of gender-affirming hormone therapy on physical performance. Essentially, what Erin said was, we have these very recent studies that shows the advantage that trans women have after 2 to 4 years appears to be almost entirely negligible among the groups studied in the data analysis. After 2 to 4 years of hormone therapy, results are well within the very large spread of cisgender body types that we see. So just wondering what your thoughts are on Moreland and Chung.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you asking that. Those are both review papers. So they're not original primary research. They are review papers. They looked at the same papers that I presented on here and that the other 9 reviews have looked at, and they came to different conclusions. Part of it with those papers is they did a mathematical adjustment of strength relative to lean body mass or relative to body height versus just outright strength. And the thing is, we can mathematically do that. And a lot of times the differences between males and females are already erased. And so to mathematically adjust that and say the differences between trans women and females are erased, well, you mathematically erase the difference between males and females doing that as well. Also, those 2 papers, they looked a lot at the Air Force papers. And in those Air Force papers, they were looking at push-ups and sit-ups and the running time. And the running time was the only one that the authors concluded, the original authors of that primary research concluded in which there was no difference after 4 years. The others, there was still a difference in the number of push-ups and the number of sit-ups between the trans women and the other females. But again, it's different groups of authors looking at the same data, coming to slightly different conclusions. And that's what we do in science, right?
And Greg, let me give you one more question. You had referenced there's not a lot of research for prepubescent, but let me just go a little further here. So this is Katie Barnes, who wrote Fair Play, How Sports Shape the Gender Debate. This is from chapter 5, which was her chapter about science. And I won't be too long-winded here, but I want to get your response to this, okay? So she says, the argument for science-based policy, no matter what the person believes is the appropriate policy on either side, are extrapolating the information we do have to apply to other understudied populations in the same community, or in some cases, applying knowledge we have about the differences between cisgender men and cisgender women to transgender athletes. There are currently no studies available that measures athletic performance specifically in transgender children or teenagers. And while we're beginning to learn more about the effects of testosterone suppression and hormone therapy after puberty, we know almost nothing on how hormone therapy affects athletic performances administered before, during, or in the end stages of puberty. So I know I just threw a lot at you there. But any response to what Katie Barnes says in her book, Fair Play?
And it's absolutely true. We don't know a lot of how puberty suppression or cross-sex hormones affects athletic performance in children or adults, but we do know the anatomical and physiological factors that contribute to athletic performance, and we see those differences. Another important thing to point out is a trans woman or a trans girl is still biologically male. And so there's no reason to think that the male pattern athletic differences don't apply to someone who's transgender. And we don't have a biological explanation for someone to be transgender. We can't say, well, they're not male when in fact they are. I mentioned how karyotyping, I think I mentioned that, really gives no insight. And so from our sex determination, we look at that policy or that process through biology, trans women are male. The other thing I would like to say is making an argument where you say, well, there's not evidence proving I'm right, therefore you're wrong or something like that, isn't the way that we should be making policy. We should look at what we have, and we again can see these differences between males and females. And so then to just say, but we don't know, so therefore we're going to stop doing what has worked, I don't know is necessarily the best evidence-based policy decision making.
Mhm. So Jess had some good questions in the chat. One of them was, aren't biological advantages just a part of sports competition? You know, Kevin Durant is a foot taller than my brother. Should we ban him from that for that advantage? And I know that's something that that Aaron brought up and spent some time on is Michael Phelps, who is celebrated for all his biological advantage, his freakish frame and his lactose acid and his wingspan and double jointedness, and he's like the perfect body swimmer. But what are your thoughts on other biological advantages that just seem to be non-controversial and socially accepted?
So again, I'll go back to, we have our distribution that I presented on, we have male athletic performance and female athletic performance. And part of the purpose of sports is to find those outliers like Michael Phelps, like Katie Ledecky, like any of the great athletes that you can point out. Part of the purpose of sports is to identify those people, right? To find the best basketball player. We have so many different running events because being a good runner doesn't mean you're good at all events, right? Whether you're like Paula Radcliffe, who's an amazing female marathon runner, but isn't going to be able to compete with an amazing male marathon runner. So that's why we have these different events, and we have the sporting categories so we can identify people based on the advantages that are conducive to that sport. A great example of this is wrestling, right? There's 14 different weight classes in high school wrestling. We don't just have wrestling, because then we would just have heavyweight wrestlers that are winning championships, right? And so we have these categories to optimize the possibilities to find these great athletes within the specific sport. And again, if we were to take the best females, they're not going to win against the best males. A lot of times they're not even going to win against good males, right? They're going to be competing with the men that are in the 70th percentile for males, not the men in the 95th percentile for males. So we have the categories for that. And again, certain sports absolutely favor certain advantages. But again, the tallest men are taller than the tallest women. And there's a position for tall men in basketball or volleyball on men's teams. There's a place for tall women in women's volleyball or women's basketball.
So Jennifer asks, how difficult is it for U.S. academics to be able to speak out on differences between male and female performance in sports? Is there pressure from institutions not to discuss this topic because it's so controversial?
So that is a great question. And I would be inclined to say, yes, there is pressure to not speak on this topic, just judging by the small number of people who seem to be speaking on it, right? When the International Olympic Committee passed their policy in 2015, when the NCAA passed their policy in 2011, honestly, I kept expecting that some of the giants in the field of exercise science would come forward to speak on that, either stating that it was evidence-based or it was not evidence-based, but they didn't. There was just this deafening silence. And it finally got to the point where I felt that I needed to say something. If you look at the paper where the group of us criticized the International Olympic Committee, there was only a couple of us in the United States and really only a couple from around the world. We had a follow-up paper published this August in which there was a total of 32 people, but again, only 5 or 6 of us from the United States. And so I think there is pressure to, I don't know if I want to say pressure to be silenced or pressure to not rock the boat, or exactly what it is that's going on, but there absolutely is some pressure to just not speak out on this, a lot of times one way or the other, because we want to avoid controversy for our institution or something, which this gives me a great point to point out that I am speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not making a statement on behalf of my university. And I've been very, very fortunate. I was directly told from one of the administrators at my institution that they support my First Amendment rights and they support my academic freedom to research on and present on topics that I think are important.
So Pam writes, how can this information best be used to help make the case for MIAA, that's the Massachusetts Athletics policy reform, which impacts student athletes? This applies to both trans girls and cisgender boys in girl sports from a fairness and safety perspective.
And this is a great discussion to have. And the best way is to go with, okay, here is the science. And so coming back to the idea of the Moreland paper, the Chung paper, or Chang, I'm not sure how you say it, Cheung. Okay, so we've got 2 or 3 reviews that say this, and then we've got 9 other reviews looking at the same information, coming to different conclusions. And you look at the bulk of the evidence, and we need to communicate that to policymakers. And I do think that we need some Solomon-like wisdom to negotiate these challenges, but I also think it's extremely, extremely important that we protect the female category because, well, we don't allow smaller, less muscular males to compete in girls' sports. And if we did, then where do the smaller, less muscular girls go? Or even where do the more elite girls go? So that's why we have these sex-based categories. And, people will use the term that is a transgender ban. It's not. It is just saying that individuals need to compete in the sports based upon their sex because sex is biological and that determines the sport's performance, not our identity.
So we're coming up on 8 o'clock. I do want to we'll go for a couple more questions here. Michael asks, what are your thoughts about new school board policy that supports coaches and team captains to forfeit games due to safety concerns? I'm going to reword that and say with transgender athletes on another team. And I guess the Dryden Rehoboth school district recently passed this policy here in Massachusetts.
And so this is a really good question. And World Rugby actually did a really good job addressing this question. World Rugby, as they developed their transgender participation policy, they consulted with transgender individuals. They consulted with sports scientists about safety. They consulted with sports philosophers about what does it mean to be fair. And they came down that they have 3 things they're looking at. Are they looking at safety? Are they looking at fairness? And are they looking at inclusion? And the conclusion from World Rugby, and we've seen this with other sports organizations as well, has stated we have to prioritize safety. We absolutely have to prioritize safety, and the anatomical and physiological differences between males and females makes it unsafe in many, many sports. Rugby is one, but you look at the pushing and shoving that goes on under a basketball hoop or the crashes that are happening in hockey and soccer. All right, the male body size gives an inherent safety risk to females when they're crashing against the males. And so if you prioritize safety, that's going to say, well, we need to separate males and females. If we look at the fairness with all the differences in athletic performance I presented, that again says, well, we need to prioritize protection of the female category. And if you prioritize inclusion, then you're jeopardizing safety and fairness. And again, like John Pike, a sports philosopher, has written about that. And again, that's from World Rugby, World Athletics. They have done these types of consultations, and that's what they have come up with. And so I think that anytime a coach or a team thinks that their safety is put at risk, they should be allowed to forfeit. Now, having said that, whether that forfeit counts as a loss or counts as a tie or something like that, that is going to vary from one policy to the next. But I think that they should be able to do that if they're concerned about the safety of their athletes. You've got to watch out for the safety of your athletes.
Jim Lyons has a question. The library director originally canceled your presentation because of, quote, lack of statistical research to support either viewpoint favoring or disfavoring transgender participation in sports. And he asks, what is your response to that? And I did just want to note that there were additional reasons in that press release as to why the program was temporarily canceled, including Robert almost having a nervous breakdown on Monday. But Greg, why don't you want to respond to Jim's question?
All right. If I remember correctly, I think I saw a YouTube video of Jim speaking to the library board. And so, Jim, I'd like to say thank you for speaking up on, encouraging that we can have these types of presentations and discussions from both sides of the matter. I couldn't tell you what information the library board looked at. And again, judging by the question, they looked at the Moreland paper and the Ada Marie Chung paper, and they looked at some of the other papers and said, well, there are disagreements. And there, it absolutely, we see this in science and we see these disagreements, and we should be able to have these disagreements and these discussions. I don't know what they looked at for the statistics and everything on it. I know the information that I have looked at, and again, I've presented a lot of that as far as the differences between males and females in anatomy, in physiology, in sports performance. And I've done the statistical analysis on that. And we can look at it as far as, with the trans women versus female athletes. Those have statistical analysis on this, showing that there are differences still between the trans women and females, favoring trans women athletes in terms of fairness, in terms of body size, those types of things. But I want to quote something here, and this quote's been attributed to Mark Twain, but it's probably been misattributed to Mark Twain, right? There's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics, right? You can use the statistics to quite often prove almost any point you want, depending on what statistical test and what data set you look at. And, I think that the library board, it sounds like there were some other serious concerns about safety, about the safety of the building and the safety of the librarians. And again, I think we need to prioritize safety. I do want to take this opportunity, though, if people are threatening the librarians over a presentation, I think they really need to give a strong consideration to what side of history they think they're going to be on. If we can't have these debates, then we're not doing what we should be doing in our country or, overall throughout the world.
That's probably a good note to end on, actually, Greg, as we're about 5 minutes over here. I do apologize. We obviously did not get to everyone's questions. We had over 150 people on the call. We had a lot of questions and comments in the Q&A box, just not realistic to get to all of them in the 15 minutes allotted time there. Greg, where can folks find out more about you?
So if you Google me, just Greg Brown, Kearney, Nebraska, it should take you to my university webpage that has my bio, has my email address, has my CV, those types of things. The website for us, it's unk.edu. So UNK for University of Nebraska at Kearney. And so go to unk.edu. I'm in the College of Education in the Department of Kinesiology and Sports Sciences. So if you click through to those, you can find a Meet the Faculty page where you could find my faculty bio. I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is, it's X these days. I'm having a hard time switching over to calling it X. Brownga Greg, all right? And Robert tweeted that out on Monday with the announcement about the presentation. So you can follow me on Twitter as well.
All right, so with that, Greg, we will wrap it up. Folks, look for an email from me in the next 48 hours with a link to this recording. And I'm really interested in the feedback survey results. So when you exit the Zoom, you'll have a feedback survey that pops up. Please take 60 seconds and fill that out. Let us know what you thought of tonight's program and what you'd like to see for future programs. So thanks so much, Greg, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks for this opportunity. And I also hope everybody has a great weekend.
Bye-bye.